Good evening to all of you here in Washington, D.C., and greetings to everyone joining us from around the world online. I'm Chris Chivas, the director of the American Statecraft program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm delighted to open this special event featuring White House Homeland Security Advisor Liz Sherwood-Randall on the role of diplomacy in addressing America's immigration challenge. The impetus for this event is our desire in the Statecraft program here at the Carnegie Endowment to think about innovative ways that the United States can address the pressing migration challenge that it faces. It seems like too often we're focused solely on the southwest border. But migration is a challenge that encompasses the entire region. And so I'm delighted to be able to announce that just yesterday, we released a major new paper that details how the Biden administration has used diplomacy to get beyond the border and address the migration challenge. The paper, which you see right here, is available on the Carnegie website. And for those of you who are joining us here in Washington, D.C., we have copies that you are welcome to take with you. The author of the paper, Katie Tobin, was integral to the design and implementation of this diplomatic effort from within the White House, where she served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Transborder at the National Security Council. So I'm going to turn the podium over to Katie now to introduce Tino Cuéllar and our honored guest.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris, and good evening, everyone. It is my sincere honor to introduce our featured speaker and my former boss, the White House Homeland Security Advisor, Liz Sherwood-Randall. For those of you who don't know, Liz actually started her career working for then Senator Joe Biden in 1986 as his Chief Foreign Affairs and Defense Advisor. To this day, Liz remains one of the president's most trusted advisors on some of the biggest, most complicated challenges facing the United States and the world. Everything from counterterrorism to mass shootings to natural disasters to building international coalitions to address the opioid crisis and migration. Over the course of her distinguished career, Liz has worked for 3 U.S. presidents. Under Clinton, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Under Obama, she served as coordinator for defense policy, countering weapons of mass destruction and arms control in the White House National Security Council, and under President Biden as the Homeland Security Advisor. I worked for Liz at the White House for 3 years, and I can personally vouch that absolutely everything Liz does, she elevates. She demands a level of ambition and accountability that is what is truly needed in the field of national security. On migration, Liz recognized early on that we needed to shore up and repair our partnerships with foreign allies and establish a forward-leaning regional framework to confront the major challenge of migration that was emerging after the COVID-19 pandemic. Liz has traveled extensively in the Western Hemisphere in recent years on behalf of the President and Vice President to advance this vision, meeting with heads of state, strengthening our bonds on these tough issues. I joined her on at least 7 trips to Mexico last year, as well as trips to South America, Central America, and into the heart of the Darien jungle. The bottom line is, and I can say this from personal experience, that the LA Declaration would not be having the impact that it is having today if it were not for Liz's leadership and vision. So I'm so glad that she has taken the time off of her busy schedule to speak with us on the topic today. I'm also, it's my pleasure to introduce Carnegie's president, Tino Cuéllar, who will be facilitating the conversation with Liz. Tino is the 10th president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Before taking on this role, he served as Justice of the Supreme Court of California, from 2015 to 2021, and he has been a longtime professor at Stanford University. Notably, under the Obama administration, Tino also served in the White House, but on the domestic side of the house. As a senior advisor on the Domestic Policy Council, he also worked on immigration policy, as well as a wide range of other issues, including criminal and civil justice, public health, and regulatory reform. So with that, I will turn over the microphone to Liz Sherwood-Randall. Thank you.
So good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with you today, and I want to begin by thanking you, Katie Tobin. Your life experience from working as a young volunteer at Annunciation House in El Paso to service as a senior National Security Council official, leading the Transborder Directorate at the White House, has informed much of what I will describe here today. Thank you for your extraordinary service and for your unflagging creativity and optimism in the face of some of the hardest challenges that we face as a nation and as a planet. Your brilliant innovation in building the Los Angeles Declaration is a lasting legacy of your leadership. When Katie departed the NSC last February, Marcela Escobari stepped into her high-heeled shoes and has been carrying this vital work forward with equal energy, expertise, and grace, for which I am very grateful. And Tino, I want to thank you for inviting me here to speak today. Your legacy of public service at the federal and state levels in so many capacities, and your continuing service to the world as president of the Carnegie Endowment light the way for those who are committed to making a difference. I appreciate having the opportunity to engage today with you about a topic of critical importance to the American people, the people of our hemisphere, and the people of this planet. When people think about migration, they often think about it as a problem that starts and stops at our border. But in fact, migration is a global problem. As a result, this significant domestic policy issue is also a foreign policy issue and a national security issue. And like all tough matters of foreign policy and national security, it requires close coordination with our key partners. Intensive bilateral and multilateral international engagement has been core to the Biden-Harris administration's approach to ensuring that American safety and security are achieved across a range of issues, including migration management. Which is why, over 2 years ago, at the Summit of the Americas in Southern California in June 2022, President Biden brought together 20 heads of state from across the Western Hemisphere to launch the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection. At the time, we were confronting new migration patterns that were fueled by a pandemic-induced economic disruption on a mass scale, by climate change, and by repression in the region by autocratic leaders like Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, resulting in an unprecedented number of people on the move. To tackle this challenge, the Los Angeles Declaration calls on all partner countries to invest in 3 mutually reinforcing efforts. First, strengthening enforcement and disrupting the smuggling networks that profit off of vulnerable migrants. Second, expanding lawful pathways to provide opportunities for people to move safely and legally as an alternative to risk-filled unlawful migration. And third, fostering long-term stabilization and integration of migrants while continuing to address the root causes of migration. Today, I'll talk about the ways in which we have collectively advanced these 3 interdependent pillars of the LA Declaration. First, we have used our immigration and law enforcement tools to deter unlawful migration and hold those who exploit vulnerable migrants accountable. Over the past decade, we've seen increasingly that transnational criminal organizations profit off of migrants. This pattern of exploitation is on vivid display in the Darien Gap, a treacherous mountain range and jungle connecting Colombia and Panama, where record numbers of migrants have paid smugglers to take them on harrowing journeys. I saw this heartbreaking phenomenon firsthand when I traveled there in 2022, as Katie mentioned, and I can tell you that what is happening in the Darien is both a humanitarian and an ecological crisis. At home, we have taken a series of steps to deter this kind of migratory movement by significantly strengthening the consequences facing those who arrive at our border unlawfully within the constraints of current laws. Under the leadership of President Biden and Vice President Harris, we have surged law enforcement personnel and resources to our border, adopted new rules and processes to streamline and incentivize lawful migration while disincentivizing unlawful migration, mobilized resources to increase investigations, arrests, and prosecutions of human smuggling and trafficking networks, imposed visa restrictions and financial sanctions on criminal smuggling networks in the region, and increased repatriation flights in order to return migrants more quickly. President Biden and Vice President Harris have repeatedly called on Congress to play its part and to update our outdated asylum laws that no longer match the realities of our times and provide more resources so that we can do more to manage our border humanely and effectively. Last year, the President directed his team to work with a bipartisan group of senators to craft a tough and fair set of border reforms consistent with both our values and our interests, including funding for 1,500 additional border personnel and more than 4,000 additional asylum officers to more quickly remove people encountered at the border who crossed without authorization. Unfortunately, the opposition to this constructive and comprehensive legislation was fierce, and it was twice voted down. As a result, President Biden had no choice but to take decisive action on June 4th of this year to restrict asylum at the border during times of elevated encounters. These actions have led to a more than 50% reduction in unlawful entries at our border since June. In the meantime, throughout our administration, we've invested heavily in building strong, multidimensional regional partnerships in recognition that we can't solve this problem alone. We have worked with countries across the hemisphere to launch new visa policies with significant results. In July, for example, Ecuador announced it was imposing visas on Chinese nationals, which helped reduce the number of these individuals arriving in and transiting Panama by 95%. And in August, Brazil imposed restrictions on the entry of Indian nationals along with other nationalities. We've also entered into biometric information sharing agreements with countries throughout the region, enabling us to identify and prevent the travel of criminal actors before they arrive at our borders. Countries such as Mexico, Panama, and Costa Rica have also significantly increased repatriations of migrants, returning them early in their journeys north before they reach the United States. Among all of these countries, our neighbor Mexico has been an essential partner in our endeavors, and I want to acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Moctezuma here today. Mexico has been an essential partner in helping us to understand the mobility of people in our hemisphere and to address the challenges we face with both humanity and discipline. Early on, President Biden established a relationship of mutual respect with President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And he asked me to work closely with Mexican counterparts to develop and scale cooperation at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels in pursuit of our joint interests across a range of security issues with Mexico, from migration to fentanyl to arms trafficking. And we have seen the results. As Mexico increased resources and personnel devoted to enforcement and limited the unsafe use of trains and buses by migrants, we saw the number of unlawful migrants at the border decrease dramatically. It's important to note that this wasn't only about us. This created a deterrent effect that benefited Mexico and other partners in the region that were also coping with large influxes of migrants that overwhelmed their border management systems and their communities. And that brings me importantly to the second element of our three-pronged approach to managing migration: expanding legal pathways. We have paired our enforcement efforts with the establishment of many viable legal alternatives, giving migrants a safe, orderly, and lawful option to choose over an unlawful and unsafe one. And we have done this in concert with our regional partners, including Mexico. They have opened up legal pathways as well, and together we have innovated to develop new approaches as circumstances presented us with unprecedented situations. For example, following Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, we suddenly started to see large numbers of Ukrainian migrants arriving irregularly at our southwestern border, seeking refuge in response to Putin's unprovoked act of war. In response, the Department of Homeland Security rapidly launched a novel initiative that enabled Ukrainian nationals to register in Europe via a tablet-based application. If they confirmed that they had a U.S.-based supporter, they could secure permission to fly directly to the United States with lawful entry at a port of entry. When coupled with strong enforcement at the southwest border, the number of Ukrainians showing up irregularly at our southwestern border literally plummeted to near zero almost overnight. We adopted a similar model with the Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans parole process. We call this the CHNV process. In this innovative endeavor that began in the fall of 2022, we established a balance. For a certain number of Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans who applied to the program from the region, were fully vetted, and had confirmed U.S.-based supporters, we offered permits for lawful arrival and temporary work authorizations. However, we made clear throughout the hemisphere that those CHNV nationals who came unlawfully and neglected the procedures we had established would be swiftly returned, and we negotiated arrangements with our partners to conduct those returns. This program also resulted in an immediate significant decrease in unlawful border encounters of those nationalities. As part of President Biden's broader four-year effort to rebuild our refugee program, we launched the Safe Mobility Initiative, with offices now across the region in Guatemala, Colombia, Ecuador, and Costa Rica. Migrants can go to these centers to be screened for protection claims and access lawful pathways without having to make a further journey. In part because of this initiative, the U.S. government has increased the number of refugees resettled from this region from just 4,000 in 2022 to over 30,000 this year. Together, these efforts have helped steer migrants away from dangerous, unlawful routes, saving lives and, over time, substantially reducing flows to our border while creating an orderly process that incentivizes lawful entry. Under the auspices of the Los Angeles Declaration, countries all over the region have stepped up to provide lawful pathways that complement ours and strengthen the incentive structure. Mexico and Canada have both made new commitments as part of the Los Angeles Declaration framework to provide temporary work visas to help fill labor gaps. And in May of this year, we launched Labor Neighbors, a bold new idea as part of the Safe Mobility Initiative to help countries with significant labor needs to attract workers. The goal of this initiative is to build a regional and ultimately global matching system, optimally one that is app-based, establishing a virtual clearinghouse for workers who can be linked to job opportunities in advance of their movement across the hemisphere and beyond. The third dimension of our approach is focused on stabilization and integration efforts in the region. The unprecedented size of the massive exodus from Venezuela, the largest migrant movement of a single population in the hemisphere's history, has highlighted the criticality of this work. Our partners throughout South America have stepped up to help absorb and provide stability to so many of these individuals and families. This is a largely untold story that is happening in this region that is absolutely remarkable. Over half of the Los Angeles Declaration partner countries have provided legal status and helped integrate more than 4.4 million Venezuelan migrants into their communities. and they continue to do so. 4 countries in South America, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, and Peru, are hosting over 80% of the Venezuelan migrants within Latin America. Colombia led the way by providing 10-year legal status to over 2 million migrants, most of whom are Venezuelan, and recently announced an expansion to include parents of migrant children. Others have stepped up as well. Last month, Ecuador extended its regularization program to 200,000 additional migrants, enabling them to apply for formal jobs and fully integrate into their communities. Brazil has pioneered a one-of-a-kind policy that matches migrant skills with labor needs all across the country. And we've been right there to support them. During this administration, we have provided over $2.4 billion to support partner countries that are helping migrants as they put down roots, enroll their kids in schools, and restart their lives in a new place. Surveys indicate that those who have legal status and opportunities in the countries where they reside tend to stay there. In fact, the International Organization for Migration has reported that only about 1.2% of Venezuelans transiting the Darien Gap between June 2022 and June 2023 had a residency permit of some kind, demonstrating that legal status in a third country significantly reduces onward migration. And the research also shows significant economic benefits of migrant integration for host countries. The International Monetary Fund estimated that integrating Venezuelan migrants could add 4.5% to host countries' GDPs in the next decade. As just one example, in Bogota, the arrival of 600,000 Venezuelan migrants has created 9,000 formal businesses and generated 188,000 new jobs. 90% of working-age Venezuelans in Colombia are employed, and Venezuelan migrants contributed over $500 million to the Colombian economy in 2022. Building on his legacy as vice president, President Biden has also been firmly committed since the beginning of his presidency to supporting economic development and democratic governance throughout Latin America and the Caribbean in order to generate stability, economic opportunity, and hope for the future. We know from years of experience that individuals who are hopeful about their futures in their homelands are much more likely to remain there and much less likely to migrate. And Vice President Harris's leadership in addressing the root causes of migration in North Central America has been a critical element of this effort. During the Biden-Harris administration, we have worked hard to craft this hemispheric system of burden sharing that creates incentives for individual and collective action to manage 21st century migration flows. Although we've made substantial progress, as with all complex challenges, especially at the intersection of foreign and domestic policy, there is so much more to be done. We have sought to adapt existing tools, and we have created new ones, including innovative frameworks like the Los Angeles Declaration, to disincentivize unlawful migration and incentivize pathways that create a safe and orderly flow to our borders. If you take one thing away from my remarks, it should be that sustained success in this vital endeavor will require us to maintain strong, ongoing partnerships with countries across the region and around the world. I look forward to discussing all this further with you today, and I thank you once again for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Liz, for those remarks, and thank you for being here. It's great to see you again. I want to start exactly where you left off, which is to think about what it takes to be in a role like the one you have right now at the White House and to provide for that sustained effort to partner. And to just give a little context, I want to note for the audience, of course, that you started in January of 2021. By September of 2021, there is group of about 15,000 Haitians who are coming from places like Chile and Brazil, making their way through the Darien Gap towards Del Rio, Texas. And that highlights that you have two balances you have to strike in this job probably every single day. One is between dealing with the migration here and now. What is going to happen in Del Rio? What is the Border Patrol going to do? What is DHS going to do? and this broader frame that you've brought to the job to think about the hemisphere, about migration writ large. The other is between everything involving migration and all the other parts of your job, the WMD piece, thinking about all the different ways in which risks can affect the U.S. that may not be quite so apparent to the public. Take us inside a little bit how you strike that balance and make sure that you deal with the here and now, but keep a more forward-looking agenda moving at the same time.
Thank you, Tino. Well, I think, first of all, you know from working in the White House that it's a team sport. We work across the White House and the many departments and agencies of the government to tackle any challenges we face. And where I started in my remarks is relevant to the answer to your question, which is we recognized very early on that we had to build a hybrid model to manage what we were facing, which was unprecedented for the reasons that I described, and that we had to build a team that crossed between the domestic community at the White House, the Domestic Policy Council, for example, domestic agencies, and the Homeland and National Security team, which dealt with relations with countries in the hemisphere and beyond. And it required something that was new to face challenges that we had never seen before in terms of the numbers and the sources of the migration that we were facing, and the desperation of individual humans who do not necessarily match the initial conceptualization of our asylum policy. And that's why I mentioned in my remarks that our asylum law is woefully outdated to meet the challenges of our times. So with much work and effort, we began to innovate to both manage the humanitarian crisis we faced. In particular, we focused quite early on the challenge of unaccompanied children. And we worked to identify ways to accommodate people safely. And we discovered that our systems were not adequate to the volume of people we needed to process in a humane and orderly fashion. And so that's why we began to do the work that I described. And the CHNV program, which includes the H, the Haitians, was innovated in part to address the need to create an incentive structure and a deterrent, an incentive to apply to come in an orderly way through a lawful permit, and a disincentive to travel irregularly, because that was the only way over time we judged we would be able to manage our border. And frankly, the American people expect us to manage our border. And that is a function of the federal government. And so we had to learn through trial and error how to do that more effectively and secure the resources to do it. I will say that I noted this in my remarks. We've had a significant resource challenge, again, because the needs far exceed our capabilities. And we need more resources to be able to process individuals who present themselves in a way that respects their human rights and also respects the rights of those who are doing the processing, because it's a very, very difficult job, and people need to have the support they need to get it done in an orderly and safe way. So that is ongoing work for us, but I would say from the beginning, Tino, the proposition for us was build a team, build it a hybrid team, which includes all the relevant entities at the White House and beyond, including all our departments and agencies that play in this, the diplomats at the State Department who helped us to build the Safe Mobility Initiative I mentioned, the team at the Department of Homeland Security that manages Customs and Border Protection, the folks in the intelligence community who helped us immensely to build a system to address the growing role of criminal elements in migration and how we could tackle that. The law enforcement agencies, which worked on the investigations, the arrests, and the prosecutions of those criminals who were exploiting vulnerable migrants. So really a whole team effort that has led to the many steps I described that we took over the course of the last almost 4 years.
Now, before that LA summit, of course, that team gets to work in beginning to shape a vision that is diplomatic in nature. And let's say that there are probably two kinds of skeptical voices that you all faced. One, let's just start with this one, is just skepticism about what can actually get done across the hemisphere. There had been more localized regional migration efforts, for example, in South America, but something hemisphere-wide that might pull together, to be perfectly honest, for those of us who've been observing migration for a while, 21 countries, and those specific countries would have seemed very surprising, in part because, for many reasons, migration is often thought about as a particularly sensitive issue, one where countries are not super happy often to be in conversation with each other about what they're going to do, how to think about enforcement, for example. So what do you think helped elevate the conversation from a domestic one to a diplomatic one and gave so many different countries, different size, some of them dealing with these millions of Venezuelan refugees, a sense that they had a shared interest that they needed to work together on?
Well, I think the first truth is that everybody in the region was experiencing this challenge. So there was an interest in figuring out whether collectively we could be stronger than the sum of our parts. And I mean, that's really at the core of the reason that I do the work that I do internationally, is because I think we're stronger when we work with other countries to face challenges that are transnational challenges. There's almost nothing that we can solve alone. If you list the many existential threats that we face as a nation, whether it's climate change or nuclear proliferation, topics I've worked on in my career, we need others to work with us or we can't achieve our goals. And in this space, I think every country came to the realization that if we came together around a set of shared principles, which is what Katie was so creative in setting forth, a set of principles we could all respect as reflecting what good governance would mean. That is the importance of creating opportunities for those who need to find a better future, at the same time that you support those who can be stabilized in their first country to which they travel, or perhaps a second country to which they travel, but not needing to come all the way to the United States. And finally, the requirement for every country to manage its borders, that any country that isn't managing its borders faces a challenge to its governance that is quite significant. So I think we invested in relationships early on. That was a signature part of President Biden's approach around the world. We didn't denigrate countries. We didn't treat them with disrespect. We sought to create collaborative frameworks that would be to their benefit and to ours. And as we worked to do really hard things together, we listened carefully to their concerns, and we tried to address them just as we asked them to listen to ours and invited them to help us in addressing ours. And that has produced significant results and has created something that's quite dynamic now and which is self-perpetuating. So what we have seen is the collaboration among the countries of the LA Declaration, with or without us, to tackle some of the challenges that they face, whether it's across individual borders or in regional groupings.
That leads to the second kind of skepticism, which was voiced even as folks who had been observing this issue came to be surprised and impressed by the number of countries, and that is a sense that it's one thing to get words on a page, it's another thing to get action on enforcement, to get pathways to legalization in different countries. What do you think has helped actually catalyze action, particularly around, let's say, enforcement and pathways to legalization?
I think the power of American leadership is pretty significant, Tino. I mean, that's just something that is a responsibility of ours, to be innovative about policy, to create options, to invest others in an approach that could be helpful to them as to us, to be flexible and adaptable based on circumstances that present themselves, to rally, marshal, raise resources to put to a problem, whether we do it on our own or we find resources collectively. We have also launched the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, looking at ways to mobilize, for example, some additional funds to support climate resilience and mitigation efforts in the hemisphere and economic development. There are a lot of ways in which what we generate provides opportunity and advantage, and I think countries see that an America that is looking to do something for the collective good is worth cooperating with. Not on every single thing, but in general, that is an approach that if we approach our cooperation with respect for our counterparts' sovereignty and with an understanding of their perspective, we can get a lot done together.
Despite all the progress, what concerns you the most? Where do you think that the LA Declaration perhaps maybe, again, despite the progress, has not quite lived up to the full promise? Or where do you think attention should turn to in the next few years as we think about how to build forward?
There are a lot of ways in which things could change. I'd like to see continuity in our policy and continuing implementation of our approach with the Los Angeles Declaration, which requires some of those fundamental values to be shared with respect to the benefit of cooperation with partners. I think we face a growing challenge from extra-hemispheric migrants who are often difficult to return, and where we have to, again, have the diplomacy in effect to negotiate agreements with foreign countries to accept their migrants. So the Chinese, for example, have recently taken back planes of migrants who had arrived irregularly at our southern border. We have also worked with other countries outside the hemisphere to do the same. This is a really very different kind of migration than we had ever seen before at our southern border. So that's something to keep our eyes on in terms of the ways in which this can be exploited by those who seek to come here for potentially nefarious purposes. And we have done a great deal of work on that too, to ensure that we have sufficient screening and vetting in place should we see that there is a pattern of arrivals that causes us concern. I think also the effects of global climate change, which create enormous pressure for migration, will continue because we are not succeeding in reducing the temperature of the planet at the pace that we need to. And so many people are going to lose their livelihoods and feel desperate to move. And that will continue to generate flows of people who feel like they need to seek a better life. Now that, again, opens the question of whether that is what our asylum system was built to contend with. My belief is that is not what the asylum system was built to contend with, and that we need to have legislative change, statutory authority to manage the border in a way that we are doing currently with our executive order on migration, which was a necessary step, but it's not a long-term solution. So in terms of worrying about long-term solutions, I do think that's something that we need to work through as a nation, agree to in a bipartisan fashion, and codify as a means of managing the border and signaling the ways in which we will receive migrants and the ways in which migrants should not choose to try to travel to the United States.
I want to pick up on that, but I also want to note that one, to my mind, innovative feature of the LA Declaration is an effort to understand that part of what can help countries in the hemisphere achieve the policy results that might be in their interest and the American interest too is resources. And there has been a concerted effort, I know, to tap the World Bank, the IDB, and so on.
Yeah.
But obviously that requires coordination and additional resources. So I just note that as one additional dimension of this. But I also want to observe that you've had as much of an opportunity as anyone I can imagine, anybody I know, to work on a whole bunch of different issues that touch on national security, defense, foreign policy. And I wonder what reflections you have on how it feels to plunge into the migration piece, having worked on weapons of mass destruction, for example, and how you might rate these different domains where you've had to roll up your sleeves and get something done.
Well, when I was asked what role I wanted to play in the new administration, if I were going to have the opportunity to serve, I said, I want to work on hard problems. So I was rewarded.
Be careful what you wish for.
Well, it is what I like to do. I had a wonderful mentor long ago, Secretary William Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense. Katie mentioned, I served the Pentagon much earlier in my career. And Bill Perry often said to us, the hardest problems are the most worth working on. And I have chosen that path. Tino, this has been really challenging to learn. It required the benefit of working with extraordinary people who knew so much more than I did, like Katie Tobin and many others in our diplomatic corps, in our intelligence community, in our military, in the Department of Homeland Security, in our foreign posts, and among our partner countries, of course, where I traveled, as Katie noted. And I feel thankful to have been given the opportunity to work on something of such enormous consequence to the American people, because that is the role of the Homeland Security Advisor. And it has been integrated for me with a truly existential challenge that I have worked on, which is to reduce the number of deaths in the homeland that are being caused by synthetic opioids, specifically by fentanyl. And that is I mean, I would describe it as a weapon of mass destruction in the Homeland. So you noted that I worked previously on countering WMD. This is such an urgent matter for us. And the work we've done with our partners in Mexico, building around the framework of all the security issues that we've engaged together in this very strong and significant relationship with our largest trading partner and our neighbor, has been critical. And I feel in that domain as well very grateful that I've had the chance to do work on behalf of the American people to try to tackle this scourge and reduce the risk that more and more Americans, in particular young people, will die of illicit fentanyl.
I know time is short, but let me pick up on that and maybe ask you a last question to zoom out to 30,000 feet. The irregular migration that is a routine feature of life in the US and on the border, fentanyl, other kinds of smuggling, guns that go south into Mexico, money and so on. How do you think about the paradoxical reality that on the one hand, the border is quite secure? If you look at apprehensions, for example, it shows that there's a deterrent effect to so much of what this administration's put in place. And yet at the same time, around the world, borders are still in some ways porous. And they present a continuing challenge to policymakers in any country, certainly in the US as well. Like, where should we realistically expect to be in 5 years?
Look, I think in most of the work we do, we're never in a static condition. Most everything we do in the space of really hard problems involves constant change. Change in circumstances that you have to be alert to and agile in responding to, and change in your way of coping with those developments. If you get stuck in one way of doing things or one way of thinking, you are going to be completely ineffective. The pace of change is so rapid. The circumstances we face and that other countries face can so suddenly be transformed. And so I think that's one of the things, if I were teaching in these days, I would focus on the necessity to be flexible and agile and creative in problem solving, to look for innovative solutions, to experiment. It's hard to do. You don't want to take risks of failure, but honestly, we have to pilot things where we don't know if they will work, and we have to keep adjusting in real time. And the best people I know in government do that. They test things out, they keep adjusting to see if they can make something work. If it doesn't work, you pull the plug and start something different. But that's required, and it's required for all governments that are going to succeed today, is to be so alert to what is happening and to the larger forces at work that are shaping what is happening, and then to innovate in response.
In closing, I feel compelled to point out that we are very lucky to have Katie Tobin as one of our scholars, but the one thing you have not done is work at the Carnegie Endowment. Perhaps at some point we can remedy that. But
That's
thank you
very
so
kind
much,
of you,
Liz, for
Tino.
your public service and for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thanks to you all for coming.